Welcome to the Empowering Women Podcast. Together, we will hear from ambitious and inspiring career women as they share their stories of success and overcoming career challenges. And now, your host, Mel the Engineer.
Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the Empowering Women Podcast. I am your host, Mel the Engineer, and I'm so glad you joined us for our inaugural episode. We've got some excellent guests lined up to share with you for season 1. Here on the Empowering Women Podcast, our goal is to bring you women leaders who can share career advice and provide inspiration. In short, we want to empower you to pursue your career aspirations, whatever they may look like. You could be working your way up in a male-dominated field, you might want to start a business, or maybe you're just looking for some perspective on work and life balance. We hope our show can be a conduit for you to access some of the women we've connected with that we think are great role models and, of course, extremely inspiring. All right, so some quick logistics. I will generally try to keep the interviews to about an hour long. However, if guests have more to share and stay longer, episodes may run a bit longer. I put in at least a couple of music breaks for you in each episode to give you a natural spot to pause if you need to. At the end of each episode, I'll typically include announcements, such as announcements pertaining to the Empowering Women in Industry organization, which makes this podcast possible. That's the important info for now, so let's dive into this episode. So, on today's episode, I will be speaking with Lynn Spivey. Lynn currently serves as the Director of Utilities for the City of Plant City, Florida. She is an engineer with extensive experience in Florida regulatory and permitting requirements in the water and wastewater space, and she has extensive experience in funding for these types of projects, so capital improvement funding and other types of community and grant programs. Lynn has a calming presence and personality, and with that comes a very unique perspective on working in such a male-dominated space. I actually recorded a couple interviews with her, so I may pull some clips from the interview that I am not using here and put those in at the end. So stick around for that if you're curious. And now, without further ado, I bring you Lynn Spivey. Lynn, welcome to the Empowering Women Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mel. Glad to be here.
Okay, so you have had an interesting career path that started in the military. Could you talk to us about how you decided to join the military and what kind of work you did there?
Sure. Military came really out of seeing it when I was at a job that had a technical background. Several of the people there were in military in the Guard and did it on the weekend. So the stuff that we worked on at the place had military parts and pieces that we made. So that's how I kind of got introduced to the military. I was going through school at night and thought that was going to be a long path, and thought, well, maybe if I join the military. I was kind of looking towards NASA. I can get the experience and the GI Bill to go to school. So that's how it started.
So what kind of work were you doing at that time where you were seeing, these technical components that were connected to the military?
We were making parts and pieces for the space shuttle, for aircrafts. I always had kind of wanted to know how everything worked background. So it started out with putting them together. That's what I did at the Track Microwave, it was called. It was in Tampa. We made microcircuits and components. So it started out with just a technical knowledge. wanting to know more. And as I thought I wanted to go to school to get my engineering degree, I had a 2-year degree at the time. That kind of fit together.
Okay, so for someone like me, this is really interesting because you were already before you had finished a bachelor's degree doing this fascinating work. How did you end up in that role?
Well, so when I first came down to Florida, I was 17 years old. I wanted to go to school, but I didn't really have parents that encouraged that. And I'll say that they were Italian, and my mom thought I should get married, and my dad was, I guess, never thought about school. So I was working in the family business. I wanted to go to college but couldn't. So the next best thing was a technical school. I had looked into what could I do at night. College classes weren't really available at night, and so I'll date myself, but this is like back in 1981. So technical school, Tampa Tech was, and I'd always been interested in science. I was interested actually in science and in music and art at the same time. And those all kind of go together, fascinatingly enough. So I looked into Tampa Tech. It had both a drafting and a technical background. When I looked into the classes, I was much more interested in more of a technical background. So I got a 2-year technical degree. Okay. And with that 2-year technical degree, I landed at Track Microwave in Tampa, Florida. And Track Microwave was a very interesting place where they did very specific micro etching on circuit boards and put together all the components, did the wired transformers, made the components, the capacitors, they were all built. And I started out building them. And then after I got my technical degree, I started working on them. Got my top secret clearance to work on them because they were parts and pieces that went into the space shuttle, into the aircrafts. So I started seeing that part of the defense system. And I found it fascinating. And from there, I met a lot of people that were in the military, had been in the military, or were still on a part-time basis in the reserves. So that's how I was exposed to the military. And when I wanted to get my 4-year degree, and that was very difficult to do, to get money for and go full-time during the day, I thought, well, if I go into the military, I can get the GI Bill, and the parts and pieces that I was working on were, involved in NASA. I got to go back and forth to some of the bases on the Cape and test out some of these parts and pieces. So that's how I got enticed with the military. I thought it would help me get a degree, and it would also help me get closer to NASA. So I kind of clawed my way through that. How do I get to school, really, when my parents hadn't even remotely thought of it? So how was it for you coming out of a small town?
Well, that's a good question. It sounds like my experience was a little similar to yours. I don't want to derail from your story too much. For me, I grew up in this small blue collar town where the only business per se that I was really exposed to was retail. So the concept of there being these B2B settings where people were working and making a good living, I didn't understand that. I didn't know anything about that except maybe what I could have seen on television. And similarly, I was not exposed to science-related careers that were anything except teaching science or what I saw on TV. So what I saw on TV maybe was like someone in a lab coat or, somebody in a lab coat that maybe had a PhD or whatever, and that was all I knew. So it was difficult to get exposure. The difference for me was that my dad and my grandfathers were in the military, and that was very much the life that I had been exposed to. So it's fascinating that your paradigm was perhaps the family business that you knew and grew up with, and you were able to kind of break out of that to go into something else. So I think it's so cool that you were able to get into this technical work early on and satisfy some curiosity and find ways to get directly into, a STEM kind of field. I think that's amazing.
When I was in high school, I took a vocational. We were able to get credit. A part of the program was they had different routes you could take, and I took a vocational route, but it was graphics, but it was all by hand. Back then there wasn't computers. And I remember my teacher would always say, everything that I drew looked like it was some sort of computer language. So I saw that when I went for art, I was really more interested in technical, and he was able to point that out to me and told me, you really don't have a place in art. You probably are more technical based.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so you did this technical degree and you worked on these pieces that went into the space shuttle, which is awesome. And then you decided to go into the Air Force.
Yeah.
Was that a good experience? And how did you decide to step out and go to school for chemical engineering? What was that like?
I thought I wanted to go into electrical engineering after being in track microwave and thinking that I wanted to be at NASA. So I kind of went that route. When I went into the military, I scored very high technical. And I think at the time they just had a shortage or were trying to get women into specific career fields. So they put me into missiles in North Dakota. So I think, was it a good experience? It was a very good experience in that it definitely taught me the limits of my what I was able to deal with. So it was very difficult. There were no women in the career field. So I think it taught me what being a pioneer is about. And, again, I kind of fumbled into that. I wasn't looking for that. So it helped me gain a lot of strength. And it also gained me the experience of technically working on parts and pieces, which I think is really important when you go into engineering. It really helps you understand design. So I'm glad of it. It was definitely a difficult time. If I thought could I do it over again? I'm not sure I would change it, even though, for a while I thought, God, that was crazy. I mean, being in missiles in North Dakota, it was absolutely freezing, go from Florida to North Dakota. It teaches you the extremes, and then it taught me how to balance, when you operate at those extremes. I think it teaches you how to balance. So I think it was a good experience, and how it got me into chemical engineering. I started going to school right away, even when I was in North Dakota. It was right near a university, Grand Forks, which was an excellent school, technically based too, the #1 agricultural school in the state, go figure. I mean, in the country. And went to school there, and by the time that I finished, I got out of the military. I cross-trained to get back to Florida. Long story short, nobody could exist in North Dakota, in my opinion, for a long period. And when I cross-trained, I came back to Florida and started going back to USF. And when I started taking circuits courses, I quickly figured that I hated it. And but I was really, really, anything chemical, chemistry came natural to me. So I crossed, and so did thermodynamics. Thermodynamics I aced easily, and circuits I needed tutoring and counseling. So I quickly figured out I needed to be in chemical engineering.
You're listening to episode 1 of the Empowering Women podcast with Mel the engineer. On this episode, we are hearing from Lynn Spivey, the utilities director from Plant City, Florida. I'd like to come back to the word you used about being a pioneer and fumbling into that. As you were going through that experience where you were the only woman there, what were you thinking about that? Did you realize that perhaps it was going to help future women? Did you find any kind of purpose in that? What were you thinking and feeling, as you were going through it and afterward?
I think seriously, the initial feeling was stupor. Sort of like, what the heck? What were they thinking? First, I was angry and like, this isn't set up for women in this career field. The career field I was in was missiles, and the reason why it was really difficult for women is that when you go out to a missile site, you have to travel like 3 hours minimum before you even get to a missile. It's extremely cold weather. You have like 7 pounds of clothes on, and there are no bathrooms out there. Let's just say that. So I was kind of shocked that it was set up so poorly to even have women enter the career field. So, at first I was like, well, if we're going to do this, it's not set up right. Who's in charge here? Oh, men. So I think what that taught me, Mel, was that these men that are so high and mighty and in charge, they don't have it figured out. So I think I can help figure it out, or I'm going to have to help figure it out if I'm going to exist in it, right? It taught me that pretty quickly, at the age of 23. And that was late to go into the military. So I think it was, I have a pretty high tolerance to fear, I think. So I didn't look at it from an angle of fear. I looked at it from an angle of, holy crap, you're kidding me, So I quickly figured out that women are needed. And if men don't realize it, we have to figure out a way to show them, because we have to live in the world that is made. So we have to become a part of it. And I started figuring that out at a pretty early age.
I think that's a great way to articulate it. Let's move forward in your career timeline. So I know you from the world of water and wastewater. Talk to us about chemical engineering and how you kind of ended up in this water environmental space after coming from this, technical place where we typically think of tech with circuits and chips and, things that make a spacecraft go.
Mm-hmm. Well, I never thought about it from an aspect of what the thing was that I wanted to figure out how it worked. So I don't think I pinpointed, and I think people from later generations got more focused. I wasn't very focused. I used to think that was maybe a detriment, but kind of made me who I am. So how I got from parts and pieces to water after going through my chemical engineering degree, and so I graduated in '94. USF, it was very geared towards the phosphate industry, because that's kind of what's around here in Florida. And though I found it fascinating from how everything works, I think I started to really comprehend its impact on the environment, and not just then how things work, but how they worked in as a part of this symbiotic relationship to the globe. So I didn't want to be in that industry. I was a consultant to it. So first I worked in it at the plant. Certainly didn't like that, and mostly Mel because it required shift work. I was like, no, I can't do the night shift. And then I became a consultant to it because I got to work on more than phosphate. So in the chemical engineering consulting fields, other than where we came from, water and wastewater, there were work on pharmaceuticals, what they call a tall oil industry, pine oil that goes into different products, and then there was a small part of some of that consulting that did some water, and a lot of it was from the industrial water treatment, but a small sliver of it was for municipal. I found that sliver somehow, and I really liked it. I thought something that cleans up the environment instead of, has a negative impact to it. So through those chemical engineering consulting companies, I found one that had a small municipal market, and that's sort of the spot that I filled. I had an opening, and that person did the water wastewater, and this was ion exchange company, and that's how I got into the municipal water market, and I absolutely loved it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you then spent a good deal of your career on the consulting side, so meaning providing services to a municipality for their drinking water or wastewater treatment or stormwater. And now you work for a municipality and in a leadership role there. Could you tell us what your role is and what you're responsible for now?
My role is the director of utilities, and I'm in charge of operations and maintenance of our wastewater and water plants and all the related outside infrastructure. Yeah, it's a lot.
I'm trying to...
Also a thing that I think I realized when I came into it that it was really a tremendous responsibility, but I had to I think I had to put it into context, otherwise it would have scared the heck out of me.
Tell us a little bit more about that. What responsibility?
Well, I think after when we met in consulting, I think I was already, I would say, ready to not deal with the corporate culture and the profession. Especially again, back to the relationship of how men and women work together in that field. But it was very frustrating at that time. I felt like I wanted to have a leadership role in it. But leadership in the corporate culture is very much tied to the bottom line. And so I think that's why it wasn't really a direct fit for me. So I was figuring out that I needed to give up on that from a corporate realm.
How do you think that corporate cultures in the engineering space could change for the better?
That's a really good question. I think to not focus on the bottom line is so foreign to the corporate makeup that it's, I think, very difficult for them to take the leap and recognize that especially in this career field, that atmosphere is very difficult to work under. That engineering is not a commodity, so you have to figure out how to make that equation work to get the best results. So I don't know. I don't see many people do. I don't see many firms doing it right. So it's a hard fit for this profession when you have a profession where it's so dynamic that it's difficult to put a price tag on an hour, how many hours it's going to take to do something. And I'm not sure, Mel, but
Out of curiosity,
Mhm.
have you seen a firm doing something different or better that you've witnessed, and what did that look like?
You know what? I think that we're it's interesting that we're able to see sort of like full cycle of this. So, before these firms were not corporate, and then they started to get bought up by corporate. And I think, like Malcolm Perney was privately owned, and there were some firms that were a little bit bigger, but so this bigger conglomerate of the municipal market firms, I think we've got to see that bloat. But I think what we're seeing now, what I'm starting to see, is small niche companies start to get engines back, because I think a lot of people are spawning off and saying, "Can't do this. This can't make this equation work right and feel good." so, so I think we're seeing a lot of these small niche firms come back again. I mean, you saw Ed go to Mead and Hunt. There's a lot of the smaller firms that are doing good. Here, I don't know if you, before you left, if you got to know some of the other smaller firms that are now, I think, doing well again, that are more employee owned, still corporate but employee owned. So I'm starting to see a big rise in that again. So I think that there is trying to be some. How do you get this right? So it should be interesting. And I think you're also seeing a lot of people from, that went from consulting going over to the municipal side also. So there's a bigger flux of that. So it should be interesting to see how it settles out.
Yeah, I agree with you. A friend of mine posed a theory about how the timing of the economic downturn around 2008 impacted sort of recent graduates from that era, ending up in a municipal position when maybe under normal circumstances they would have gone into consulting. And she
Mm-hmm.
feels like that has breathed a lot of new ideas and sort of
Yes.
initiatives in some places.
Mhm. I agree. I think I see a lot of people going over now to this side of the house, and I think what helps is that how to do a project, how to negotiate a project. There's more knowledge of that, so I think maybe we're getting better projects and an evening out of how to better run the municipal market.
Absolutely. Could you tell us about your thoughts on being a woman in this male dominated space and your opinion on how to best interact?
So I think there's so much more women now in this space that I think just by the numbers, we're learning how to work better together, men and women. I'll just say start that kind of in general, but I think it's important to see where where the needs are. I think women are really good at that. They're good at seeing where the weaknesses are and how to nourish them. Okay, I think women are kind of natural nourishers, whether it's to children, and that doesn't matter. But we kind of have that eye of what's wrong here and how to fix it. And if you can communicate that need, I think you find a good space in how to work in a male dominated field. And I think not sure if I ever really thought, okay, my opinion matters here, listen to me, other than I thought about how do I get through to these folks who don't credit me, don't give credit to my opinion? And why don't they give credit to my opinion? How do I change that? How do I get them to understand that I have a point that might help?
So
I think if women could figure that piece out, so taking it from a listening and figuring out then how to communicate how their point matters, that's how women, I think, gain a lot of strength.
you're speaking to some of the struggles that women have talked about encountering in male-dominated spaces quite a bit, namely either not being listened to or their ideas basically co-opted by another man in the room. So I think what I want
Or having to work twice as hard to get that
to get the recognition.
Yes. Yeah.
So I want to come back to communications in general in a moment, but I want to finish this idea. I think what I'm trying to parse out here from you is what are your thoughts on women going into this field and excelling? So a woman who has ambition, whether that's to become a better engineer, become a better project manager, or to take over a company, what do you see as some of the struggles, and what are some of the ways you have learned over the course of your career to deal with those?
The struggles in just a big picture, and you can detail it out in many different forms, is that it's not fair. So if you got to sort of have to go in with eyes wide open, it's not a fair situation. So you're going in knowing that. Hopefully women are into this field, I think. So the next thing is figuring out your reaction to that. Is it going to be, continuous strife and anger, or are you going to figure out how to use that strife and anger and figure out tools to break through, strengthen yourself? So I think I made that conscious choice that I didn't want to be angry about the unfairness, that I wanted to recognize it, but figure out how to make tools out of that instead of how to build resentment. And I think, if you're not careful and don't recognize it, the resentment just starts to build, and then you don't know what to do with it. You don't know how to make tools out of it. So I think, again, women, they do have some natural tendencies to figuring out how to do that, how to take anger and figure out how to make energy out of that. So I think that some of the best advice is to really take a look at the landscape around you, recognize that it is unfair, and then figure out, what you're going to do, what little piece you can do to help with that.
It sounds like part of what you're talking about here is mindfulness and having the awareness in the moment to say, this is going on, and take a deep breath, and how am I going to address it? So whatever the situation might be at work, we talked about having an idea co-opted, but there's other things that happen too. Is there anything that you have experienced that you would be comfortable talking about in maybe slightly more specific terms, and how you deal with it? And I think what I'm trying to get at here is, there will be many women in the audience who will listen to this, and some men. What is important in your mind, in your opinion, to share on navigating this and bringing awareness to some of the men who we work with as well, or who are leaders?
Right. Well, how do you deal with it? I think you figure out your boundaries. And I'm not sure if that's a difficult task. So I guess I'll just speak through it to how I figured out my boundaries. So when I, started in a very male-dominated military field, I think I quickly saw some of the extremes of the unfairness. So I learned pretty early that if I didn't set boundaries, that I was going to enable behavior that I didn't want towards me. I think everybody's situation is different to whatever extreme. So I figured out very quickly with men, especially men in supposed leadership positions, that it was important to set boundaries, and that I had to figure out pretty quickly how to make those boundaries known.
Can I ask you to expound on that a little bit? Because today, when I hear about boundaries, I hear that a lot in terms of romantic relationships, but I don't hear it as much in the professional kind of setting. Could you just expound on what you mean there?
Sure. So I guess that was the first time that I figured out that, okay, now whether it's military or job or how, whatever, that there was a man in charge that was telling me to do things that were definitely not my job. So even as far as making coffee, demeaning tasks, and then sexual advances, all at once from a commanding officer. So I had to figure out, so I'm in a situation where not only is it, a little bit more stringent than a typical job because it's the military. It's not like I can say, okay, I quit and leave. So I quickly was put in a situation where I had to figure out, okay, how do I get boundaries known here? I had several actions I could take. I could blow it up and make it really uncomfortable. And of course, that was an option if I was going to be any kind of real danger. So, at that point, and I don't think I was even ready for it, truthfully, I was thrown into a situation where I had to figure out, okay, how strong am I? What's my level right now? And what can I do? I can go straight to the top to the commander of the base and tell him what's going on. But there's, a whole line of men that are similar to this. How much do I want to go that route? Or again, do I figure out how to fix the situation? And if I do, what does that mean? What do I have to do? How do I set my boundaries? So I had to figure that out, and I had to take that anger and say, okay, what can I do to fix this? And I experimented. I set my boundary and said, hell no, I'm not making. First thing I did was I made coffee and I put cigarette ash in it, and thought, I'm going to show you that if if you tell me to do something that's outside of what I think this career field is, this is how I'm going to show you how I'm going to do it. So I started experimenting with that boundary and trying to figure out how do I work with this idiot and figure out how to communicate, take this person, use him as a tool, and figure out how to set my boundaries. Say, no, I'm not going to take this. No, I don't want your sexual advances, and I will go to the top. So instead of going to the top, I threatened him, and I played with that line until I figured out, where my level of strength was, and then how to increase and strengthen that. So I started, instead of running away from these guys, I started figuring out how to communicate and show them that I have a strength and that I can be a force to be reckoned with.
That was a great story. Thank you.
Well, it was interesting, Mel, because and I'm stuck in the frozen tundra out there, you know. So you quickly have to figure out or be a weak link. So I, at that point, knew, women were coming into this career field. These guys were going to have to get used to it. There was plenty of wrong going around there. It was like inefficiency all around. And like it or not, women are going to be half of this working force. So move over.
I think this is a good segue into a more general communications discussion.
Mm-hmm.
You've got some pretty strong ideas about the need for better communications in a setting like engineering and the need to bring those types of talents into this field. Could you just tell us about some of your thoughts there and how those came to be?
Well, I think how it came to be is, I think the probably, and I'm not sure if this is true or not, maybe this is something that can be researched, Mel. Do all science fields have a problem communicating? So I think by nature, because STEM fields are not maybe common knowledge, that there are communication issues just by that nature in and of itself. Then on top of that, these have been male-dominated fields for a long time. So, we're stuck, I think, right now with career fields that are, one, difficult to articulate on a common language basis to start with, and then this new mix of men and women together from these male-dominated fields. So I think communication is needed for a lot of reasons. And, even women in science fields tend to be a little bit less, not as good on communication skills as normal. So, I think there's a big need there. So if you are a good communicator, I think that one thing that it lends to two big things. Internally, I think it lends to just our career field working better, because now we are a force of a lot of men and women. And then also it helps with just articulating what we're doing and the need for what we're doing to the general public. And so I think women have filled in these gaps and these big needs.
Let's talk about that more in the setting that you work now. So you're in the public sector, and you're responsible for not only the physical assets of the municipality, but the people who are operating them, maintaining them, projects to upgrade them. Talk to us about the public communication piece, and what do you see there? There's arguably, we haven't, as an industry, done a very good job of communicating the value that we bring to people day to day. So how is that unfolding, and where do you see needs?
It's an exhaustive gap right now. That is how I feel. It's exhausting. There's such a lack of understanding and such a misperception that there's a huge chasm of how to communicate the need. So a lot of work right now, I think, coming around. And I think that maybe we'll figure out that, social media actually has a place in helping. But yeah, there's big gaps in the understanding. And now with people having, I think, a tough time disseminating factual information. It's so it's a rocky road.
What are some of the main items that you think the public potentially misunderstands or has been misinformed about with respect to water and wastewater?
The cycle of water, the true cycle of water, and the misperception, the lack of understanding of water quality and the history of water. So there's, I don't know, there's just, I don't think that the general public understands where their water comes from, and how they fit into the equation of water quality too. So, there's a ton of concern about what am I drinking, but not a ton of concern of what am I putting in the ground, or how am I contaminating, or what am I putting in my body that then goes out of my body and then goes back into the ground, So I don't think humans ever have figured out really very well how they fit into the relationship with the world, or that they actually are part of that relationship. So it's all part of that.
Absolutely. Lynn, you're involved with something called the Potable Reuse Commission. So for our listeners, could you first explain to us what potable reuse is, and then talk to us about the Reuse Commission, particularly in the context of what you just described about how critical effective communications in a STEM setting is?
Great question, Mel. Okay, the Potable Reuse Commission is an initiative that was conceptually used in water reuse and water reuse organization, the association. And when our Florida section decided to put together first we thought it would be a technical advisory sort of panel commission. Then we thought a little bit bigger and thought, who are really the water-related stakeholders in Florida that would have to deal with potable reuse? And what potable reuse is taking advanced treatment of wastewater to the level where it can be put back into a potable supply, either indirectly through an environmental barrier, indirect potable reuse, or through direct advanced treatment, where we'd go from advanced treatment of the highly treated reclaimed water right to distribution through a potable system. So that's what potable reuse is. Florida thought the stakeholders in this would be utilities, municipal utilities, and then industries like regular industry in Florida, agriculture, the medical community for the safety of it, the Department of Health, again, for the safety. And so those are the stakeholders that the Potable Reuse Commission put together. So it's 4 utilities representing the Florida Water Environment Association and AWWA and Water Reuse Florida. Those are who those utilities represent. And then agriculture, we used Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association, USF, Department of Public Health, the dean from that program, Associated Industries of Florida, and then the Department of Health from the Department of Epidemiology. So really a series, then for an environmental stakeholder, also the Nature Conservancy. So I think it's really a unique way to take a very collaborative approach to how do we see water, how do we use water, how do we make sure that it's safe to use it, and what are the needs of this water and how to best share it. So it's really interesting to sit at the table with these stakeholders and figure out how to do this, and then hand this over to legislators and say, okay, we have everybody's buy-in. This is good policy that helps everybody. So the part of communication in that. Do you want me to expand a little bit on that, Mel?
Yes, absolutely.
Because that has been really the toughest challenge on every level. Not only trying to articulate the water cycle to all the stakeholders, to understand that we make sure that we understand that message together the same way. It has been a real challenge to have this group, which is now it's usually about 40 to 50 people at least at these meetings, and then several people on the phone, and then comments coming in. It's amazing to hear the different perspective and then try to formulate a message. So it's taken a lot of work and dedication, but I think what this has shown is that it can get done. It can happen. You can have several voices and actually take all of them into consideration and come out with a singular message. So it's been good in that aspect. So that's the lemonade. The lemon is that it's amazing to me how varying and how the lack of understanding is on the public of what the water cycle is. We finally figured out that we had to hire a PR firm, that we, with all of that talent, I mean, some of the brightest minds really in Florida in our market, that we cannot message properly. We figured out we have to hire somebody to do that.
So tell us something a little more specific there. What was the message that maybe the group struggled to get to the public that had to be conveyed by
that the water's safe, that it's,
Okay.
basically getting over the public perception of drinking wastewater, and understanding that de facto water reuse has been happening always.
Right.
Always.
And so let's talk about that for a moment, because not everybody listening to this will be in our industry. So de facto water reuse being, we use water, we send it to a wastewater treatment plant, it gets treated, and then it gets sent back out into the environment, whether that's in a river or a lake or injected into a well.
Into the aquifer or in a rapid infiltration sand basin. It goes back into the water system. There's nowhere else to put it. You think about some of Florida's bigger plants are 100 million gallons a day. Take something like City of Tampa and Miami, much bigger. These are small systems compared to places like where you are now, Mel, in Chicago. So billions of gallons of treated wastewater effluent go back into the water system, and always have. Same thing with, our natural water bodies. They take in stormwater, they take in rain that comes through the atmosphere. So there's a water being treated either through our natural systems or through wastewater or through water treatment, and it's all one water, same water being used over and over again. There's a finite amount of pure unused water from our underground aquifers. How long do people really naturally think those are going to last? And I don't think people have thought about that. We're kind of the first generations that figuring out that just another doubling of our globe and we'll be out of water. So
right. I mean, just the sheer number of people
yeah,
here now versus in years past.
Right.
So I think the interesting things that you kind of pointed at here, in my opinion, are this piece where helping educate the public about the safety of how we treat water. And maybe I'll try to find a couple of resources on that topic to put in the show notes so others can access it. And then the other part there is that we have artificial boundaries of our cities and counties. Well, the aquifers and rivers don't recognize those boundaries. So what you're describing with this group of stakeholders coming together, that's critical. We're going to have to have the ability as a society to communicate these things, and people have to be able to mediate these conversations to come to consensus. Or we'll be fighting over it.
Yes. And that's what the Potable Reuse, that's the interesting part about this Potable Reuse Commission, is that it's consensus based now. So it's awesome. It's not yes or no vote. It's, well, yes, I agree, but I have challenge here. So you figure out what people's challenges are, and then you figure out ways to overcome them. And I think that that's a great model for how we need to go into the future with this equation. We have to figure this out now. Otherwise, it's going to be serious repercussions. There already are, serious repercussions that we're going to have challenges overcoming. But, our inability to do long-term thinking and really understand holistically how we fit into the resources of this globe, that's a struggle. Fake news, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we are about out of time,
I know.
and so I want to end with this question. We've been talking a lot about the importance of communications, and so what I want to ask you is, you've made it to a really noteworthy leadership role in this water and wastewater space, and I expect you'll do more. But what I want to ask you is, what characteristics do you think are important to embody and demonstrate as a leader that is beyond communications? What are some of the other aspects that you think are important just as a leader in general?
I think important aspects of leadership is really the ability to enable people around you. You know, I think people have different definitions of what leadership is, but I think true power comes from that. I found that that's the best way to really be a respected leader, somebody that people want to be around, follow. And so I think the ability to strengthen the team around you is an important aspect of leadership. I think the other aspect of leadership is having strengthened your knowledge base enough to be an important component in making it better. And that makes, I think, a natural leader when you want to become part of the equation of making something better. So I think that shows true strength. So truly wanting to have the knowledge base to become effective in moving forward what you're doing. I think leadership, that's one of those words that I sometimes I'm uncomfortable with that word. And when it's used in context with me anyway, because I don't feel like, I'm not saying so much I don't feel like leader, but I think leadership quality really does mean being able to stand up for more than just your voice. So that's a responsible place to be, so you have to take that seriously.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing is recognizing that responsibility. And taking it serious is really a good leadership quality. Otherwise, it go into dictatorship. Right.
So,
well, let me ask you this: what would you say is your mantra when you get up and go to work? What is it that you see as your top, most high-level priorities?
You know what I say? Truthfully, it's I have to remind myself that it's not about me. That I have to be very careful to not serve my own ego and make sure that I'm vigilant to the mission, and that keeps me focused on what I'm there for, and that I'm a part of it, and I'm a symbiotic part of it, and doesn't put me out of context. So really, I have to say that it's not about me. Otherwise, I can get to a point where you're using whatever frustration or whatever for the wrong reason. So
how would you articulate that mission?
For me, I have a job and I'm responsible for almost 100 people and what we do. So I have to stay vigilant to what our mission is, providing safe drinking water and making sure that we stay in compliance with our wastewater. So, and making sure that we use ratepayer money a specific way. So I have a very specific job that I have to make sure that I stay vigilant to make sure that we're running at best. And so it can't be about me. And to me, every day that's what keeps me being a good leader, is making sure that I understand the 1,000 parts and pieces that we need and how to best meet that need and how I fit into that.
Well spoken. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Mel.
Thank you so much for joining me today on the Empowering Women podcast.
Thank you, Mel. It was a pleasure.
Wasn't Lynn fascinating? I hope you enjoyed hearing her story and perspectives. I thought it was particularly poignant how she described exploring setting boundaries. And another way I like to think about this concept she described is experimenting with your own personal power. Dear listener, I would like to thank you again for downloading and listening to the Empowering Women podcast. A couple of quick announcements. First, I'd like to share that the upcoming 2 episodes will feature 2 more powerful women. Episode 2, I interview Renee Joseph. She is a global VP of Sales and Customer Enablement for Johnson Controls, which is a multinational conglomerate. Renee works in the HVAC space, which has been male-dominated for an extremely long time. She shares her story of working her way up the corporate ladder without having a technical education background. Then in episode 3, I'm speaking with Jenny Hahn, a Chicago-based architect who leads operations for Skinder, which is a highly innovative architectural and construction firm. So stay tuned for those. Okay, next announcement is that the Empowering Women in Industry organization, which I am a partner of, is hosting a one-day conference in Chicago this September, so September 2019. This will be a powerful event featuring high-powered women leaders who are coming to equip you with the tools to enhance your career prowess. I will be there and I would love to meet you. So head on over to empoweringwomeninindustry.com to learn more. That's empoweringwomeninindustry.com. And I hope to see you there. Last but not least, if you would like to get in touch with us, head over to empoweringwomenpodcast.com. Also, you can reach out to me directly. My email address is meltheengineer@gmail.com, and you can find me on Facebook and Twitter under the same name, just Mel the Engineer. Thanks again for listening, and if you found this episode at all valuable, please consider visiting iTunes and leaving us a positive review. It means so much to the Empowering Women team, and it helps others to find the podcast as well. Thank you so much for listening, and until the next episode, this is Mel the Engineer signing off.
Thank you for joining us for an episode of the Empowering Women podcast with Mel the Engineer. If you find the Empowering Women podcast helpful, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts. Our show is a partnership between Mel the Engineer and the Empowering Women in Industry organization. Learn more by visiting empoweringwomenpodcast.com.
So what were your responsibilities like in consulting, and how were you able to progress as an engineer and as a leader?
So I wanted to really be involved in the design and understand how everything fits together. But after a while, if you're a good communicator, you quickly get involved in marketing and consulting. So I kind of became that seller doer model.
Okay, so for listeners who maybe haven't been in the consulting space and don't know that lingo, what does seller doer mean in that context?
Well, it means that you help to market the services that your company is providing. So you market what you're doing and you target the jobs and put together proposals for project work. So I think that's something that they don't teach at all when we're in school, right? Really
Yes.
how to communicate at all in engineering. But I think that that's also one of the most important lessons that should be taught. And if you learn it early, I think your career really progresses. The ability to communicate and understand that the product that you're doing and the service that you're giving has to be marketed in order to be able to compete for these projects. So if you can understand that pretty quickly, I think it's easy to progress through a company.
have you encountered any struggles in this industry, water, wastewater, as a woman? And what does that look like, and how have you navigated it?
I think we can say consulting, whether it be water or wastewater. So the struggle is typically the way that I saw it, Mel, that still I think women have to work a lot more and a lot harder for the same or similar role of a counterpart, of a male counterpart. That was the first notice of it. I didn't really have a mindset of that kind of discrimination. Didn't think of it that way in the beginning, but I think you begin to see that you do more, you work more, and you're not getting that equal recognition. So I think that I didn't want to look at it as gender inequality, but I wanted to, when I started to notice that, I wanted to think of it more as an opportunity to educate and get past it. So I think that's what I did. Instead of saying, "Oh, why aren't I'm not getting the same recognition," I found ways around it, and that builds a skill set. So I think it's a long journey, though, to do this, and that's a tough recognition to think, okay, women are strong in the workforce, but there's still inequalities in whatever way, if it's in pay or position or recognition or whatever, and it's going to take a while for that not to be that way. So it's a journey, and that takes education and educating your counterpart instead of punishing. So I had some issues with the Me Too thing because of that. I think not a lot gets done in the realm of lashing out and punishing. It's more on educating and understanding and empowering. So I've always tried to do that when I have a male counterpart that is, I feel challenged in that way, either that I'm not getting recognized, I'm doing more work, or however to educate the value of collaboration, irregardless of gender.
Could you give us any more specifics on what that might look like? So if a woman listening to this feels like she's struggling with what you're mentioning here, recognition, how would you advise her?
I think it's important to show your value. And so if you're not getting recognized, I think it takes an understanding of why you're not getting recognized. So working with your counterpart to understand how they think and what are the barriers. So understanding the barriers to your recognition or whatever the inequality would be. My first real experience with not getting it was really not getting respect or recognition, and it was when I was working at my first real technical job at the company where we put together parts for the military. And in a quality control check, the gentleman who was performing that check really felt strongly that women shouldn't be in that role because they were taking men's jobs. And he was open about that with me. Well, it took a long time, but after a while, I gained his respect by trying to understand how he felt, and instead of getting mad about it, ask him why, and then gaining his trust in conversation and communication. And even though it took several years, 3 or 4 years, when he was leaving, actually retiring, his comment to me was that even though he still had issue with a lot of women in the work field, workforce, that that I was excellent at my job and I deserved my position there. So even though I didn't completely sway him about women, I opened up his mind a bit. And so it's a this is what I mean by a journey. You might not get the respect or the recognition that you think you deserve at that point, but if you educate and open somebody's minds a little bit, I think you have expansion there and opportunity in it, and then it builds. I think there's a problem now with this immediate gratification realm that I think we're all in. So patience for this kind of journey is, I think is what's needed. I think it's important to be willing to listen to another person's point of view, even if you don't agree with it, and understand why they've come to that place. I think it really helps in an overall wider understanding and also the ability to be open to input and new ideas. So I think that really helps develop a well-rounded person. And I think that's needed in this and right now in this world. And I think that I worry that the social media realm doesn't facilitate that well enough because it's so immediate in response.
I agree with you. So it's immediate, and much of it is also just sound bites or single phrases or sentences. I see what you
Or emotional kind of outcries. So I think it's going to be a challenge. I worry about this next generation. It should be interesting because I think it's hard to really understand where a person's coming from. It's easy to hear their opinion, but it's not easy to get where they're coming, why they came to that conclusion, that opinion. And I think it really takes understanding that to have enough compassion and empathy to be open to what they're saying, and then find ways around the barriers that can keep dividing us. So it's going to be an interesting challenge for these next generations coming up.